Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. Each week of this podcast is either an interview with a guest or multiple guests, or a solo episode where I unpack some scholarship in relation to computer science education. In this week's particular episode, I'm unpacking a paper titled Computational Thinking for an Inclusive World, a resource for educators to learn and lead. This paper was written by Kelly Mills, Marika Coenraad, Patty Ruiz, Quinn Burke, and Josh Weisgrau. Apologies if I mispronounce any names. As always, in the show notes, you can find a link to this particular paper, as well as a link to other resources, such as other podcasts relevant to this episode. And you can find the show notes by clicking the link in the app that you're listening to this on, or by simply going to jaredoleary.com and clicking on the podcast tab. While you're there, you'll find hundreds, if not thousands, of free resources for computer science educators, as well as some content for gaming and drumming, because I stream on Twitch and create content on YouTube. So stop by sometime and say hi. Speaking of stopping by somewhere, I highly recommend going to bootuppd.org, which is the nonprofit that I work for, who powers this podcast. If you visit bootuppd.org, you'll find a ton of free computer science education resources that I have created, and you'll also learn more about our paid professional development. All right, so here's the abstract for this particular paper. Quote, technology is becoming more integral across professional fields and within our daily lives, especially since the onset of the pandemic. As such, opportunities to learn computational thinking are important to all students, not only the ones who will eventually study computer science or enter the information technology industry. However, large inequalities continue to exist in access to equipment and learning opportunities needed to build computational thinking skills for students that experience marginalization. We call all educators to integrate computational thinking into disciplinary learnings across pre-K-12 education, while centering inclusivity, to equip students with the skills they need to participate in our increasingly technological world and promote justice for students and society at large. This report issues 2 calls to action for educators to design inclusive computing learning opportunities for students. 1, integrate computational thinking into disciplinary learning. And 2, build capacity for computational thinking with shared leadership and professional learning. Inspired by the frameworks, strategies, and examples of inclusive computational thinking integration, readers can take away practical implications to reach learners in their new context. End quote. If I were to summarize this paper into a single sentence, I'd say that this paper includes strategies for integrating computational thinking into disciplinary learning and for developing capacity for computational thinking. All right, so this paper is 66 pages long, so I'm going to go through it as quickly as I can while just kind of hitting on the salient points. I do encourage you to read it. Got a lot of resources and examples that are worth exploring that I'm not going to dive into, but I do hope you take the time to actually take a look at it. And again, it's a free paper, so you can find a link to it in the show notes. All right, so here is a very quick overview of what they recommend. This is from page 5. Quote, to provide all learners, especially those experiencing marginalization, opportunities to engage in computational thinking, it is essential that educators integrate computational thinking with the topics they already teach, like art, English language arts, math, science, and social studies, end quote. And so the recommendations that they provide are, quote, leverage synergies between disciplinary learning and computational thinking, provide opportunities for students to build computational thinking skills in the younger grades, and promote student agency and purpose, end quote. And right below that, quote, integrating computational thinking into every classroom is not something that can be left to individual educators. Educational leaders must prioritize the initiative and build capacity for teachers to do so, end quote. So here are 3 strategies that can be done in order to do that. So, quote, promote shared leadership among districts, schools, and teachers, develop sustained individualized professional learning opportunities, and integrate computational thinking into pre-service teacher education, end quote. It's from page 5. All right, so those are just the recommendations, and the rest of the paper is going to kind of unpack why it's important to do that and how you can do that. So the first main section of this paper is the introduction. And so in this introduction, they're saying, hey, because of COVID-19 and just because of, the general purpose of computational thinking, we think this is an important skill for students to develop. In particular, because we don't want kids to just consume technology, we want them to be able to create it. And they explain that it's especially important for kids who are experiencing marginalization to learn computational thinking because they think it would be very helpful. And in particular, it should be integrated into every single class, and that it really needs support from administrators to be able to do something like that. Here's a quote from page 8, and this gives a summary of the rest of the paper. Quote, it is divided into 3 sections. First, we present a brief overview of computational thinking. What do we mean by the term, and how do we apply it in practice? Next, we examine the current state of K-12 computing education and the persistent challenges of providing students with access to computational tools and addressing systemic inequity in computer education and the tech world more broadly. To combat these challenges, we propose a framework for computational thinking integration with inclusive pedagogies at the center. Finally, we describe two distinct needs for educators to create inclusive learning opportunities for computing. One, integrating computational thinking into disciplinary learning, and two, building teachers' capacity for computational thinking. We describe strategies to address each need and highlight examples of educators using each strategy in action. By the end of the report, we hope that readers will have identified concrete next steps to further inclusive computing education in their context, end quote. That is an excellent summary of the remainder of this paper, which is like 50 plus pages after this. So in the next main section, they talk about, well, exactly what is computational thinking? So the way they situate computational thinking is within the broader umbrella of computing, and it merges together and blurs together with computer science and programming, but all of those fit within the bigger umbrella of computing. And they have a nice Venn diagram that kind of compares and contrasts from the past to right now in terms of how computational thinking was viewed. So on page 10, there's a very important clarification here. Quote, while computer science is an individual academic discipline, computational thinking is a problem-solving approach that integrates across activities. The skills and practices requiring computational thinking are broader, leveraging concepts and skills from computer science and applying them to other concepts, such as core academic disciplines. For educators integrating computational thinking into their classrooms, we believe computational thinking is best understood as a series of interrelated skills and competencies, end quote. It's from page 10. And they describe it a little bit further down. So this is a very important thing to consider. Having been in CS education for several years now, I believe that we will never actually come to a unified definition of computational thinking. Spoken with many people about it. There's some very interesting opinions about it in terms of thinking like a computer or thinking like a computer scientist, etc. And everybody disagrees with everybody else about whatever their definition is. So it's really important that we understand how these authors are framing this. So they're saying that computational thinking in this context, in their framing, is a problem-solving approach, and it can be integrated across all activities. And these concepts and skills are from computer science, and they're applying them into other context to solve some kind of a problem. All right, so on pages 11 and 12, they actually kind of talk about, well, what are these skills and what are these practices that make up computational thinking? And by the way, the authors use the terms concepts, competencies, and practices, and they kind of all blend together. So that's not just me switching up the different terms and whatnot. So the first set of skills include abstraction, algorithmic thinking, debugging, decomposition, pattern recognition, and selecting tools. And then the computational thinking practices include automation, computational modeling, and data practices. And so they mentioned previously that these are all interrelated. And on pages 11 and 12, they include not only like the list of these skills, but also a description for each one and then an example for each one of them. So if you're curious, well, what do they mean by selecting tools or decomposition? Check out the descriptions and the examples in there. Hopefully it gives some clarification for you. But these are all interrelated with each other and kind of work together to make up what they are describing as computational thinking. Now, here's an interesting quote from page 13. Quote, although both plugged and unplugged activities are valuable learning experiences for students to build computational thinking skills, leveraging technological tools where appropriate can support learners to connect and apply these skills to engage in computational thinking practices in the older grades, end quote. I totally agree. So yeah, I think there are some like really fun things that you can do with unplugged, but it often decontextualizes things in ways that really don't make sense, in my opinion. The way I've described it before is like, okay, it's like you're trying to teach somebody how to play the drums without actually giving them some drums to play on or some sticks to use. Like, yeah, you can learn some drumming concepts, but you're not going to become a good drummer unless you actually have drums with you. Trust me, I know. I played the drums for well over 20 years and taught it for just under 20 years. So it's the same thing with computational thinking. If you want to learn these skills and these concepts and be able to apply it, especially like coding and whatnot, you need a code. Yes, you can learn concepts, but when you do it outside of application, especially in ways that are driven by students' interests. All right, so there's more information in this section. As with all the other sections I'm going to cover, this is a very quick introduction. I'm encouraging you to actually read it, but I hope this podcast will like highlight some sections that you might be like, ooh, I really want to check out the section titled The Current State of Computing Education, which is the next section starting on page 15. Here's an interesting quote on that page. Quote, while all 50 states have some policy in place promoting computer science, the role of computational thinking within these initiatives is ambiguous. The K-12 computer science framework, which many states use to develop standards, integrates computational thinking into 4 of the core practices, reasoning that the most effective context and approach for developing computational thinking is learning computer science. They are intrinsically connected. Consequently, most data points for participation and achievement in computing education are directly related only to computer science, such as enrollment in elective computer science classes in high school and associated test scores. End quote. Page 15. That's really interesting. And the reason why I think that's interesting is because it's saying that the framework says the best way to basically learn computational thinking is to learn it through computer science. And why I find that interesting is because so many people are trying to integrate computational thinking into subject areas that are not computer science. So putting it into ELA or social studies or math or science or whatever. So what I don't understand, is just me thinking out loud, this is not a criticism or anything. I enjoyed reading this paper. My thought is, well, if the best way to learn computational thinking is in computer science context, and we think that all students should learn how to do this, then shouldn't we focus on efforts that makes computer science mandatory? As opposed to, hey, instead of making computer science mandatory, let's just integrate computational thinking into a potentially less effective domain, i.e. not computer science. So like ELA or something. But that's just me thinking out loud. And I'll share more thoughts a little bit later at the end of this episode, because that's what I do. Later on, the authors do note a little bit further down that the resources and the amount of time required to do like its own standalone CS course are not always feasible. And I totally get that. But I'd also argue if computer science or computational thinking, either of them, are so important for every single student to learn, then we need to make time for it. No excuses. But instead, many administrators are forced with these time crunches of, well, computer science is not tested. Computational thinking is not tested. It's not part of the core curriculum, reading, writing, arithmetic. So let's just embed it in there and then cool, we can have our cake and eat it too. But in my own opinion, I think that's a disservice. I've seen some schools say, oh yeah, we offer and teach computer science to all of our students. And by that, what they mean is they do like an hour of code. Great. That's awesome that you spent an hour throughout the year working on computer science. Happy for that. But to say that you have a computer science program is a bit misleading if you're only spending that amount of time. So if you are embedding just computational thinking into other areas with the hopes of being able to check off some standards, that to me is saying, hey, we think this thing is really important, but not as important as all these other things. So if we're going to engage in discussions or discourse around computational thinking, the way that this is framed is, hey, this is an extremely important set of skills and practices to learn, but not as important as, every other subject area that we're going to integrate into. But those are my 2 cents. Now, there's a subsection here starting on page 16 that's talking about how we tend to measure the success of computer science through the AP computer science course and how this is pretty problematic. One, this is only offered in high schools, as far as I'm aware. None of the kids I worked with in the elementary schools took AP classes that I know of. But two, there's a certain demographic cluster that tends to take AP tests over others, and marginalized communities tend to not take as many AP courses, especially if they have a lower socioeconomic status and don't have the intention of going on to college. So if all of our experiences related to computer science are being assessed by something that not every student is going to participate in, we're not really going to have a good understanding of how successful we are at broadening participation in computer science or computational thinking. Again, because of my background in music education, here's an example from music. It's like saying, well, how many kids are enrolled in the orchestra? And using that to figure out how diverse the music program is, when there's also a band, a choir, a percussion ensemble, music production studio, etc. So yeah, you could look at AP test scores, but that's going to give you a very narrow slice of the pie, because ideally your school is offering more than just AP computer science, and ideally you're also offering it below high school, so like middle school and elementary. All right, so the next section, page 17. So this is on reimagining computational thinking to be more inclusive. So this section, I'd recommend spending some time diving into some of the resources that are listed here. If you haven't listened to many episodes, you'll find that there are a ton of episodes discussing equity and inclusion and access and all sorts of things that are important for educators and especially computer science educators to consider. So you can actually dive into some of these a little bit deeper by checking out some of the previous podcast episodes. But there are 3 categories that the authors recommend for classroom educators. And these strategies include designing accessible instruction. The second one is connecting to students' interests, homes, and communities. And the third one is acknowledging and combating inequity. So here's a quick summary from page 18 of each of these. Quote, designing accessible instruction refers to strategies teachers should use to engage all learners in computing. Connecting to students' interests, homes, and communities refers to drawing on the experiences of students to design learning opportunities that are connected with their homes, communities, and interests to highlight the relevance of computing in their lives. Acknowledging and combating inequity refers to a teacher supporting students to recognize and take a stand against the oppression of marginalized groups in society broadly and specifically in computing, end quote. Now, again, there are several podcast episodes for each one of these particular topics. For example, under designing accessible instruction, they mention universal design for learning, which I've unpacked some papers on. Also talked to Jesse Rathgeber and Andreas Stefik about accessibility and whatnot. So check out those podcast episodes. When it comes to student interest, homes, and communities, check out like the podcast with the interview with Mitch Resnick. And honestly, most of the podcasts, because my own approach in the classroom and with the curriculum I designed for Boot Up is all about students' interests guiding their learning. But there are some specific episodes that I'll link to in the show notes. And then acknowledging and combating inequity. Many of the podcasts also discuss this, unpacking different frameworks like KPOR centers, culturally responsive and sustaining pedagogies, the discussion with Nikki Washington, and the discussion with Joyce McCall, and so many others. So again, I'll include links to these in the show notes, which you can find at jaredoleary.com. So the point of these 3 different sections in here, in this particular paper, is to say, hey, when you're doing computational thinking, you need to do it in a way that acknowledges and combats inequalities, that also is designed for accessible instruction, and it is also connecting to different student interests, cultures, etc. I strongly agree with all of those ideas, but I don't think it should be limited to just computational thinking alone. I think good computer science practice and good education in general includes all of those things. And I say that as somebody who is taught in multiple subject areas. So this is not just unique to computational thinking or computer science. All right, so the next section, what districts should focus on, integrate learning and develop capacity. So this is the bulk of the paper. So the first main need that they focus on is integrating computational thinking into disciplinary learning. Here's a quote from page 21. Quote, integrating computational thinking can be beneficial for both the expansion of computing opportunities and disciplinary understanding. From a computing perspective, computational thinking integration conceives computing as a tool for understanding other disciplines and topics, and therefore as an inherently relevant skill. From a disciplinary content perspective, computational thinking can deepen disciplinary learning. Some integrations will place a greater focus on computing, while others will place the greatest focus on disciplinary concepts. Ideally, an integration balances computing and disciplinary learning to promote both. Then, CT can become a value add to disciplinary learning and not an add-on to an already overscheduled school day, end quote. It's from page 21. So to do this, they have 3 different strategies. The strategies are leveraging synergies between disciplinary learning and CT, developing computational thinking skills in the younger grades, and promoting student agency and purpose. So for each of these 3 different strategies, they provide an explanation of, well, why is this important? Here's some research that suggests it. And then they provide a couple of examples for each one of them. Different contexts, explaining, well, here's how they did it. Here are some things to think about. Here's how it relates to computational thinking and X subject area. So in the first section that's on leveraging synergies between disciplinary learning and CT, they provide a very quick overview of like some pre-K, 3 through 12, and 6 through 12 standards in arts, ELA, math, science, and social studies. They have between like 1 and 3 examples of, well, here's how you might be able to use this in the arts. Here's how you might be able to use this in math. And then following this, they have 2 different examples. So one is on integrating computational modeling into middle school science for bilingual students. So check that out if that sounds interesting. And then the next one is on exploring health disparities using data science in high school biology. And those are pages 24 through 28. So in the second section on developing computational thinking skills in the younger grades, they say it's important for younger kids to engage in computational thinking because it can help them develop an interest in some foundational understandings of computing. So the examples in here are on integrating life-relevant computational thinking into preschool, and then integrating computational thinking into elementary ELA. And so those are from pages 29 to 32. And then for the third strategy on promoting student agency and purpose is all about, quote, providing student-centered learning experiences so that students are driving decisions about what tool to use, how to use it, and for what purpose. Provides them with opportunities to gain experience, autonomy, and confidence in computing they can take outside of the classroom, end quote. Now, one of the things that I really appreciated that they mentioned is there's a continuum of how you can actually implement or integrate computational thinking. I've mentioned in other episodes about integration of computer science as a whole, how there are many ways you can do it. That could be subservient or multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary, etc. So I'll include links to those episodes in the podcast, as well as some episodes that kind of dives deeper into, well, what do we mean by curriculum? But for here, they talk about how computational thinking could be a simple enhancement through a full-on transformation of how you actually engage with a subject area or domain. This reminded me very much of SAMR, which SAMR is an acronym for substitution, augmentation, modification, and redefinition. So the enhancement would be the substitution or augmentation. We are going to use computational thinking to substitute or augment a subject. And then the transformation side of things is modification or redefinition. So we're going to have a completely new way of experiencing this subject area or this particular concept in a domain because of computational thinking. I would argue from my own perspectives, having read a lot of scholarship on computational thinking and seen a lot of lesson plans that talk about and integrate computational thinking, the vast majority of computational thinking is done through substitution or augmentation and does not actually get into modification or redefinition, i.e. it does not really transform the learning experience unless it uses an approach that was actually outlined in computational literacies, which I did an unpacking scholarship on, a particular paper by Kafai and Proctor. So I highly recommend checking that one out. If you're interested in computational thinking, computational literacies, in my opinion, is like the next best thing for a variety of reasons that I kind of talk about within that episode. One of the interesting things that I do notice when people talk about how computational thinking can be transformative is it's usually done using a computing device to design, create, or analyze. So like being able to analyze large sets of data or create some kind of a computational model to simulate something or demonstrate something. But thinking out loud, whenever I see stuff like that, it makes me go, well, then is it the thinking that's important, or is it actually using a device that's more important? But because it makes me think of that, it just, again, brings me back to SAMR and makes me go, okay, well, SAMR is a framework for thinking through integrating technology in meaningful ways. So you're not just like swapping out a whiteboard for a tablet and going, look, we're using technology, but instead using the tablet and going, hey, instead of taking notes on here, we can create mind maps that are hyperlinked to projects that students create all on the same device. That is a modification or a redefinition of what you can actually do because of the device. So again, going with this line of thought, if we're going to get into transformational computational thinking, I'd like to see some more examples of just the thinking that is transformational and not just the use of a device that actually makes it a transformational experience. But those are my own biases. In this particular section on promoting student agency and purpose, they do have some examples. So one of them is on students identifying social justice community needs so that I can inform an app design. And then the other one is on promoting student agency in data practices. So if those sound interesting, make sure to check out pages 34 all the way up to 38. Now on page 39, there is the second need, which is on developing capacity for computational thinking. And so we have strategy 1, which is promoting shared leadership among districts, schools, and teachers. Strategy 2 is on developing sustained, individualized professional learning opportunities. And then strategy 3 is on integrating computational thinking into pre-service teacher education. So for the first strategy on promoting shared leadership among district schools and teachers, what they recommend for CS is to have consistency, to make it so that CS is cumulative and that it is competency-based. But in order to do this, the authors argue that many leaders can't do this on their own. So it's really helpful to have support. And I'll include a link in the show notes to the CS Equity Guide, which is really helpful for administrators because it's written by administrators who are interested in implementing computer science in equitable ways. So I highly recommend checking out, 1, that podcast episode that unpacks it, and then 2, the actual Equity Guide, which is now being rolled out into more states than just California. So check it out. Now in this section, they talk about how many different districts implement CT in different ways. Some of them use it as a tool, some of them use it as a theme, and some of them use it as competencies. Just like how there's no unified definition of what computational thinking is, there's also no unified way of actually integrating it or implementing it in other subject areas. So it's really important when you're sitting down with your schools to figure out, 1, are we trying to integrate computer science or computational thinking or both? And then 2, what do those actually look like? And make sure that we have a shared definition before you actually start going in and start implementing it. Because you might say, hey, we're going to integrate computational thinking into our classroom, and that's going to mean something very different to a different person if they have a different definition of computational thinking and what it looks like. So for example, here's a quote from page 39. Quote, "With tools, districts provide technology and programs to teachers such as Scratch, Code.org, and Project Lead the Way. With themes, they embed these tools into integration approaches such as maker learning or STEM. With competencies, districts focused on student knowledge and abilities such as algorithms, data, and computational modeling. Competency-based pathways are an effective strategy to define computational thinking while providing educators flexibility to select appropriate tools and methods of instruction for their students." End quote. Now, in this particular section or strategy, they provide 2 different examples. So one of them is on designing K-12 computational thinking pathways in rural Alabama. And then another one is on developing school capacity using computational thinking integration framework. And so these are discussed from pages 40 all the way up to page 44. And on page 45 is the next strategy on developing sustained individualized professional learning opportunities. So in this particular section, they mention that, quote, "Teachers have indicated that challenges to integrating computational thinking into their practices include limited planning and instructional time and identifying connections between computing concepts and core content. End quote. It's from page 45. One reason why they might not be able to make those connections between computing concepts and core content is because they don't have a very solid understanding of computing content, or like computer science in particular, or computational thinking in particular. Another reason why is maybe there aren't great connections between that subject area and computational thinking or computer science. As I mentioned before in other podcast episodes, many people have talked about how computational thinking can be used to analyze music. And I've looked at that as a professional musician and music educator and said, I don't know anyone who's done that. From the standpoint of a composer, producer, a musician, or a music educator, it just doesn't make sense. Yes, you can find patterns, but that's not what we do when we are creating music. There's so many more nuances and complications than just figuring out where there are repeats. So I say that to say maybe computational thinking is not actually a good fit outside of limited application in a subject area. So just because we can come up with a couple of simple examples of these potential connections to different domains doesn't actually mean it's robust enough to use everywhere and at any time. But in this section on teacher support, they suggest that we provide opportunities for ongoing professional learning, we clarify grade appropriate terminology, provide access to exemplar lesson plans, create some strategies to assess student work, and help develop the recognition of computational competencies. Then the authors provide some examples on differentiated readiness-aligned professional learning for elementary educators, which is from pages 49 through 51. And then finally, we get to the very last strategy, which is on integrating computational thinking into pre-service teacher education, which is, I know, a huge step towards helping preparing future educators. And they include a variety of different sections of what teacher educators might be able to do, including like building partnerships between CS educators and teacher educators, introducing computational thinking within the educational technology courses, applying it across different methods courseworks or practicums, creating some resources and tools that actually define computational thinking, which good luck with that, providing opportunities for pre-service educators to apply computational thinking in different disciplinary environments to problem solve, and provide coaching for how to apply CT practices in the classroom, and then engaging various stakeholders across higher education and local school districts. So if any of those sound interesting, make sure to check out pages 51 through 52, as well as the examples such as computational thinking and universal design for learning and introductory education coursework, and integrating computational thinking into methods courses and student teaching experiences. And those are starting on page 53 all the way up to 56. And then on page 57 is the conclusion. And after that, it's just all of the references and whatnot. All right, so at the end of these Unpacking Scholarship episodes, I like to provide some lingering questions and thoughts. This is not critiquing the authors or anyone who's interested in computational thinking. I do have some general questions about computational thinking, and in particular, the way that it's discussed. So I just share them on here because I think we should talk about it more as a field before we actually continue to promote computational thinking. For example, it would be really helpful if we actually had a definition of computational thinking that people agreed upon. The other episodes that I've done that talk about inclusive pedagogies and equity-centered pedagogies have very clear needs. Totally agree with that. I do, however, disagree that there is a clear need for computational thinking. A question that I've asked previously on this podcast is, when is computational thinking and the discourse around it a form of epistemological colonization? So colonizing our ways of learning or knowing. So for example, in this particular paper, and again, this is not a critique for the authors, there was phrasing that computational thinking needed to be prioritized by district leaders on page 21. On page 28, they mentioned that it's really important for young children to learn computational thinking because this sets up pathways to get into other areas of computing. Then on like page 18 and 19, it's talking about how computational thinking gives some skills that allows people to understand technology and computing processes. And so I agree that, yeah, maybe computational thinking would be useful for understanding computing, but why is it that that makes it necessary to learn in literally every subject area, which is what was proposed in this particular paper and has been proposed in many other papers that I've looked at. If computational thinking has skills and practices that are specific to solving problems, what if those problems don't need computing devices to solve them? So why is it that we view everything from a technocentric framing? Yeah, it's pervasive in society, but it's not pervasive in every single academic domain. And even if it is, it's for different reasons than just to solve problems. To dive a little bit deeper into the questioning, the way that people discuss computational thinking is that it often comes across as reifying a collection of tools. But a collection of tools is not a heuristic or process to think through. So because computational thinking isn't really a process to go through, it's often framed within discrete tasks or activities, but rarely is it actually discussed in relation to broader learning goals or purposes of studying a particular subject area. So if we use language from like Wiggins and McTighe, who talk about understanding by design and big ideas, these are the questions that are core to a subject area that not only can students explore, but professionals in the field are also exploring it. And a lot of the big ideas that I have seen in different subject areas, in my opinion, aren't going to be answered through computational thinking. But little problems that arise in relation to those big ideas might benefit from some forms of computational thinking, but a lot of these domains honestly have their own frameworks for thinking through. So for example, design thinking is very useful for engineering and design, and it is a process, or at least it is framed as a process of empathizing, defining, ideating, prototyping, and testing. It can be a linear process, but it also has the opportunity to cycle back through the process at any given point. This is very different than a collection of skills and practices, that people can actually agree what skills and practices count as computational thinking and what skills and practices do not count as computational thinking. So for me, what I'm wondering out loud is, why is computational thinking more important than a heuristic like design thinking? And why is it so important that it's being encouraged to be pushed into every single subject area? Why can't it just be a tool or a set of tools that is used when it is needed, rather than promoted as something everyone needs to do in every subject? So to combine this questioning of this collection of tools with the previous point about epistemological colonization, again, this is me reflecting on the points of this paper. This is not a critique of the authors by any means. But the way that people generally talk about computational thinking is it's as if scientists who are really passionate about the scientific method said that every subject area should learn and use the scientific method. But the way that they talk about it is as if they only spoke about instances where it sort of applies to a subject area, but isn't actually getting at some of the bigger ideas or core ideas within that subject, but instead are just finding almost like a affirmation or confirmation bias examples of where it might sort of fit. But the biggest difference that I see between this hypothetical scenario of scientists engaging in epistemological colonization through the scientific method is actually a process to think through with some steps that people agree upon, and not just like a relatively vague set of skills that can be interpreted many different ways. So one thing that I think might be helpful for the field is to define, when is it not computational thinking? So for example, it's framed as a problem-solving approach, but not all learning is problem-based, nor are there any set of skills or practices that are universal to solving any given problem. So when does it make sense to engage in computational thinking, and when does it not make sense to engage in computational thinking? So while we tend to highlight instances where computational thinking fits within a discrete activity, we also need to talk about when it does not make sense to use computational thinking. I think this would help educators immensely. However, I also think it would be very helpful for the field to really take a look at Kafai and Proctor's discussion of computational literacies, which I think helps clarify some of the issues that I see with computational thinking, and in my opinion provides a more useful heuristic to think through. And you might disagree, and that's okay. You can come on the podcast and tell me. I'd honestly love to chat with somebody who completely disagrees with me on this, so I can learn from you. And if you want to do that, you can find the Contact Me button on my website by clicking the link in the app that you're listening to this on, or by going to jaredoleary.com. Or you could honestly even join me on Twitch someday and jump in the chat and ask me questions about computational thinking or provide your perspectives. I think it'd be funny to do that. Playing Elden Ring or Fortnite while chatting about computational thinking. Let's do it. Anyways, I'm getting too goofy right now, so that is my cue to wrap up this podcast. I do highly recommend reading this paper. I enjoyed going through it. There are a ton of resources and examples that are very relevant to a variety of educators, so I hope you consider taking the time to checking out the actual paper itself, and maybe sharing this podcast or the paper with a friend or colleague. Stay tuned next week for another episode, and until then, I hope you're all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.